December 1941, a dim warehouse on the outskirts of Birmingham. A single bulb swings above a metal workbench, its light reflecting on piles of unfinished gun parts, crude steel tubes, square bolts, rough welds that still smoke faintly from the last torch. The sound is steady and monotonous, clinks of hammers, the hiss of acetylene, and the echo of footsteps on concrete. Every bench looks identical, every worker silent. There are no polished tools, no precision machines, no chrome. Only cut pipes and stamped plates. A stack of brown paper envelopes marked Sten, MK1 rests on a corner table. The name looks improvised, handwritten in pencil. Outside, frost gathers on the corrugated metal walls. A military truck backs up to the loading dock, its tires leaving deep ruts in the mud. Two men in wool coats inspect the crates. Their faces are expressionless, but one notes the production figure on a clipboard, completed 5,000 units, this week. Inside each crate lies the same thing, a simple submachine gun made from plumbing pipe, a few screws, and 9 pieces of cut steel. It costs less than £3 to build. In London, the War Office has just approved full-scale production. The weapon looks crude even by the standards of 1941. It has no wood furniture, no blued finish, no elegance. The barrel is exposed, the stock a welded rod. British officers who first tested it called it an insult to craftsmanship. But Britain is running out of options. The evacuation of Dunkirk has emptied the island of small arms. Every rifle and Bren gun is needed for home defense. The Sten is not built for pride, it is built for numbers. In the cold air of the Enfield factory, men measure speed, not perfection. One welder finishes 10 guns in a morning. By evening, assembly workers fit each with a side-mounted magazine that jams if handled carelessly. The test firing area is small and enclosed by sandbags. A sergeant pulls the trigger of one prototype. The weapon rattles for 2 seconds, then stops. 40 rounds expended. Brass casings bounce off the wall. He marks the acceptables on a tag and moves to the next. Across the channel, German intelligence photographs new weapons captured in North Africa. They see the Thompson, the Bren, and Mauser copies. The Sten is not yet among them. It remains a secret, a weapon of necessity. By the end of the year, the Ministry of Supply orders 500,000 more. The calculations are precise, a Sten gun can be built from 6 pounds of metal and one man's labour in 5 hours. At an airfield near Hendon, a squad of Home Guard volunteers stands in a line. They hold the new submachine gun for the first time. Their fingers trace the rough welds and cold edges. The instructor demonstrates loading, a push, a twist, and a sharp click. The men exchange glances. It feels too light, too plain, too cheap. One mutters, "You wouldn't trust it in a fight." The instructor only nods. "That's the point," he says quietly. "It's not for us." He gestures toward a table covered with brown packages labeled in French, Dutch, and Norwegian. The Sten's true destination is clear. It is not designed for the parade ground or the factory inspection. It is designed to be dropped at night, packed in straw, and hidden under floorboards. In the coming years, tens of thousands will land behind enemy lines, in barns, forests, and city cellars. Back in Birmingham, the last worker of the shift hangs his apron and wipes the soot from his hands. The floor is scattered with metal shavings. A foreman signs the final sheet for the day, output complete. There is no ceremony, no applause. Only a quiet acknowledgement of what has just begun, the creation of the cheapest weapon ever to shape a war fought in the shadows. By 1942 the Sten moved like a rumour through occupied Europe. Night parachutes opened over fields, white silk glowing against clouded sky. Wooden crates hit soft earth with dull thuds. Men waited in black coats beside hedgerows. They pried open lids and felt for metal wrapped in oilcloth. The gun felt ordinary in the hand, cool, slightly greasy from machine oil, the stamped receiver biting at the thumb. It fit into sacks, between loaves of bread, and under false bottoms. Resistant cells learned to carry it in pieces. A magazine slipped into a boot, a bolt nested in a tobacco tin. Assembly became a practiced ritual under lamplight. A farmer's daughter turned spanners with steady fingers, a priest in a cellar threaded the barrel into place. The weapon required no specialized knowledge, only common tools and a steady hand. That simplicity made it versatile. It could be mended with pliers and a hacksaw. It could be disassembled and hidden in a roomful of hay. Operational reports emphasize speed. A partisan note from 1943 lists preparation time: 5 minutes to uncrate, 8 minutes to assemble, 3 seconds to load. Ammunition arrived in waxed paper bundles, often mismatched and corroded. The Sten's magazine would sometimes not seat, improvisation followed. A strip of cardboard shoved into the feed lip corrected the angle. A bent spring from a sewing machine replaced a broken follower. These were not inventions, they were adaptations born of necessity. The Sten side-mounted magazine defined how it was used. Soldiers learned to fire from the hip in alleyways, sweeping the muzzle in quick arcs. The weapon's balance altered when the magazine was full. At close range it compensated for poor marksmanship. In cramped spaces, cellars, tramcars, narrow streets, it was decisive. Urban engagements favored volume of fire over long-range precision. Resistance fighters exploited that fact. Reports filed by SOE and Mi-9 record missions where the Sten was decisive. A Central European communique lists sabotage teams cut from vehicles in less than a minute. An account from a Parisian cell describes an ambush at dawn: a tram stopped, insurgents sprang, and the Sten spoke through the fog. The account notes the weapon's faults, occasional jams, misfeeds, and a disconcerting tendency to fire when dropped, but concludes the outcome justified the means. Property was damaged, rail lines were severed, a German patrol melted into shadows. Distribution networks grew improvised and efficient. Allied airdrops used coded map references and shepherded enclosures. Submarines and fast launches delivered crates to remote beaches under moonless skies. Couriers rode bicycles through checkpoints, their panniers lined with oilcloth to muffle metal. In towns, shopkeepers hid weapons inside sacks of flour. Postmen sometimes carried parcels that contained nothing more dangerous than a length of pipe. The weapon's cheapness made concealment banal, a factor as strategic as range or rate of fire. Occasionally, a Sten landed in the wrong hands. German police found unmarked boxes and catalogued parts in dusty stations. They reported them as foreign miscellanea, little more than scrap. For every seizure, dozens more slipped through. The arithmetic favored the concealed. 100 crates concealed among thousands of legitimate shipments became invisible. The enemy's attention was drawn elsewhere. Technical officers noted an unexpected advantage: the Sten's variability. With dozens of minor production differences, serial numbers meant less. 2 guns built in different workshops behaved differently under the same conditions. That divergence complicated enemy intelligence. Interrogation reports show confusion when captured weapons did not match known profiles. The Sten became a moving target for those trying to trace origins. At night, in cellars and attics, men and women tested magazines by firing at discarded tins. The sound was short and metallic, a staccato breath in the dark. Each report was followed by a small exchange of practical advice. File the lip a fraction, someone suggested. Use this oil. These small improvements spread by word and note, becoming part of the weapon's living manual. By mid-1943, distribution had created a quiet network across Europe, stitched together by the Sten's very ordinariness. Resistance operations multiplied, and the weapon accompanied them like a basic tool, unremarkable, necessary, and pervasive. Following these movements, intelligence officers began to see a pattern emerge. The Sten was not simply a gun, it was an instrument of decentralized warfare. By 1943, the question inside the War Office shifted from production to impact. By late 1943, the reports arriving at Whitehall were no longer anecdotal. They contained figures, times, and coordinates. A single SOE dispatch enumerated attacks against rail infrastructure over a 6-month span, 24 separate derailments attributed to small sabotage teams. The field returns recorded weapons expended, replacement parts sourced locally, and the time between receipt of an airdrop and first action. Those intervals measured in days, not weeks. The Sten shortened that window. Technical appendices appended to mission reports converted impressions into hard data. One supply memorandum compared weight and bulk. A crate containing 20 Sten guns and ammunition weighed less than a single crate holding for Bren's. A parachute load could therefore carry 5 times as many Stens for the same aircraft fuel cost. Command calculated the tactical multiplier plainly: more weapons delivered per sortie produced more independent cells armed and active. The arithmetic was not rhetorical, it was logistical. Captured German railway logs later corroborate disruption rates. Lines reporting sudden breaks increased where resistance activity concentrated. Military intelligence cross-referenced those interruptions with SOE coordinates and discovered overlap. Analysts noted that operations relying on rapid ambushes favored weapons that could be assembled quickly. The Sten matched that need. Its effective range was limited, its purpose was not to engage infantry in open fields. It was optimized for contact within 25 meters, where accuracy yielded to volume. Production statistics reveal the scale of the decision. Workshops across Britain and in occupied factories produce tens of thousands per month. A War Office ledger lists factories, output per week, and average man-hours. Each entry reads like an industrial ledger: metal ordered, seams welded, magazine stamped, test firing logged. The weapon's low cost and minimal material requirements permitted production in sites unsuited for precision arms. Market research of the time would have called it low capital, high throughput manufacture. The result was an unprecedented diffusion of small arms. Field intelligence added qualitative measures. Interrogations of captured German officers cited a growing paranoia about anonymous attacks. Orders to increase convoy escorts and patrol densities followed. Those defensive measures stretched German manpower. A brigade diverted to guard railways meant fewer troops on occupation duty in nearby towns. The Sten, by enabling frequent small-scale sabotage, contributed to a reallocation of enemy resources. It did so without notable single-battle victories, its effect accumulated through attrition of control. Medical reports from partisan units provide another line of evidence. Casualty lists, treated in improvised clinics, show a rise in encounters where submachine carpeted fire accounted for close-quarters wounds. Surgeons described entry wounds consistent with short-range engagements. Pathologists noted fragmentation patterns matching .303 rounds fired at close distances. Those clinical notes became indirect measures of tactical prevalence. The Sten did not merely appear in thefts or ambushes, it shaped the wounds of the conflict. Even procurement data from neutral ports reflect its spread. Ship manifests list parcels and crates routed through covert channels. Intermediaries paid for transport in small sums, the items listed as hardware or machinery parts. The documentation demonstrates that supply chains adapted to the weapon's form. Men who organized drops required less training to handle distribution. A single courier might move dozens of disassembled guns through a town's black market. Intelligent summaries also record failures and costs. Jamming, accidental discharges, and feed problems appear frequently in after-action reports. A percentage of weapons, sometimes notable, were returned as unserviceable. Yet the overall operational calculus favored quantity over flawless reliability. Commanders noted that a partially functional Sten was often more useful than no weapon at all. By 1944, the cumulative statistics had a policy effect. Allocation of tonnage for partisan supply increased. A directive adjusted aircraft load plans to prioritize compact arms. The language in memos changed from tentative to programmatic. Production targets rose, distribution networks formalized. In quiet paragraphs of staff notes, planners acknowledged a simple fact: an ordinary, inexpensive tool had altered the parameters of covert warfare. The realization was precise and limited. The Sten did not win battles by itself. It changed the tempo and geometry of resistance. That change, measured in crates, sorties, and interrupted railway timetables, proved decisive at scale. Post-war inventories catalogued components with the same flat tone as battlefield logs. Wooden crates stamped Sten surplus lined docks in Liverpool and Tilbury. Technicians opened boxes and counted receivers, springs, and barrels under sodium lights. Some crates had never left the island. Others carried foreign stencils from drop zones in France, Norway, and Yugoslavia. The handwriting on shipment tags recorded more than destinations. It recorded habit, the habit of concealment, of improvisation, of reusing ordinary supply lines for covert purpose. Museum curators later noted the weapon's banal appearance in photographs. It sat on display with a plain label, Sten Mk2, mass-produced submachine gun. Visitors paused, not from awe but from curiosity. The object looked more like plumbing than arms manufacture. Yet the accompanying archives told a different story. Files next to the case contained a map smeared with ink, a list of airdrop coordinates, and a ledger noting which rural parish had reported rail sabotage the previous month. The juxtaposition was deliberate, the unremarkable metal and the extraordinary effect it had enabled. The post-war testimony of resistance leaders was functional and stripped of rhetoric. A Breton organizer described how deliveries arrived in socks and potato sacks. A partisan in Warsaw recounted learning to assemble one blindfolded after a bomb had shattered a window. Their language spoke to utility, reliability when materials were scarce, repairability when specialized parts were impossible to obtain. They did not praise design elegance. They recorded outcomes. Trains stopped. Offices were emptied of files. Bridges lay twisted across riverbeds. The list of disruptions read like minutes in an operations room. At academic seminars in the 1950s, military historians reframed the Sten within a theory of irregular warfare. Papers compared cost per effective mission, using formulas that treated the weapon as a variable. Analysts modeled distribution rates against enemy reinforcement schedules and concluded that mass-delivered, low-cost arms produce non-linear increases in sabotage frequency. The data-driven conclusions were cautious but consistent. Radical decentralization of firepower altered occupation dynamics. The Sten was evidence in a broader argument about scale and access. Engineers preserved the Sten not for its craftsmanship but for its lessons. Manuals annotated in margins instructed how to adapt springs and file feed lips. Workshops kept spares of stamped parts alongside more sophisticated armaments. An engineer visiting a former wartime factory noted the presence of crude jigs used to stamp magazines. The jigs themselves were objects of interest, simple fixtures that turned unskilled labor into consistent output. Their existence explained how production could scale without industrial elegance. legal records from post-war trials reveal another measure of impact. Statements from collaborators and informants catalogued attacks where improvised Stens were used. Prosecutors used forensic reports to tie weapon fragments to specific raids. Those trials produced dry, bureaucratic accounts of violence, but they also preserved operational detail. The fragments became data points in reconstructing networks previously hidden in darkness. Through court transcripts, historians traced lines between airdrops, local handlers, and the eventual tactical effects. Culturally, the Sten entered folklore among veterans and civilians alike. In songs and memoirs it was the unglamorous companion of resistance. Poets did not glorify its metal, instead they noted how it fit beneath a child's bed or into a church organ loft. Photographs show it wrapped in newspapers, not in satin. Those small images became symbolic, the ordinary object enabling extraordinary acts. The symbolism was practical, not heroic. It emphasized how clandestine warfare reproposed the everyday. Economic studies decades later returned to the same arithmetic. Cost-benefit tables placed Stens beside more expensive weapons and adjusted for parachute sorties, aircraft availability, and crew risk. The conclusion remained unchanged. In contexts where access was constrained and risk localized, a high volume of cheap weapons outperformed fewer precision instruments. The Sten's efficiency came from its compatibility with existing logistics, not from technical superiority. When historians speak plainly now, they describe an industrial decision that generated strategic effects. The Sten was produced because resources were limited and choices had to be made. Those choices privileged availability over sophistication. The result was a distribution of capability to actors outside conventional armies. Those actors, operating in shadows and attics, multiplied the weapon's influence. In a final, quiet footnote, an end-of-war memo observed the blunt truth: the Sten altered the calculus of occupation by turning concealment into mass supply. After the war, engineers and logisticians reconstructed supply chains with the same clinical attention given to battle reports. They traced flows of material from manufacturer to drop zone and tabulated loss rates at each junction. One after-action study measured losses during transit, theft, seizure, and simple misplacement. The greatest inefficiency, however, lay not in transport but in dispersion. Weapons sent in large numbers diluted retrieval risk. A single parachute drop carrying 50 Stens could arm 10 cells rather than one. That arithmetic changed planning assumptions about resistance logistics. Archivists handling SOE files found repeated emphasis on compatibility. Spare parts for the Sten fit ordinary tools. Ammunition calibers matched other British small arms, easing resupply concerns. The standardization of .303 rounds across theaters meant that local caches could be used interchangeably. Command memos note this pragmatic benefit plainly: commonality reduced the need for bespoke supply lines. The pages are bureaucratic yet decisive. They document the quiet engineering of interoperability. In former occupied towns, oral histories recorded mundane exchanges that reveal networks. A baker remembered trading loaves for cartridges. A schoolteacher hid magazines in textbooks. Those memories, when aggregated, produce a map of civilian cooperation. The Sten required a social ecosystem as much as a manufacturing system. Without willing hands to assemble, conceal, and transport, the weapon would have remained only a crude object. Its effectiveness depended on human practices that adapted ordinary life to clandestine ends. Military theorists later used the Sten as a case study in asymmetric distribution. They compared its performance with that of specialized units armed with finely machined weapons. The comparison underscored a principle: in environments where detection risk is high, simplicity and concealability multiply force. The Sten's physical plainness contributed to that concealability. It could be hidden as plumbing or farm tools, as a piece of ordnance or, in many cases, as nothing more than a length of metal. That ambiguity was tactical. Intelligence reports captured another pattern. The Sten facilitated initiatives by small, leaderless groups. Cells lacking formal command structures damaged infrastructure with minimal coordination. The weapon's user-friendliness reduced training time and lowered the barrier to armed action. Resistance leadership notes from 1944 record directives instructing newly formed units in simple drills, how to assemble, how to clear jams, how to avoid accidental discharge during transport. Those directives were terse and practical. They prioritized survivability over marksmanship. Where the Sten appears in photographs, it does so without ceremony. It lies on a kitchen table, wrapped in cloth, next to a child's wooden toy. It appears in hands calloused from work, not in gloved fingers posed for propaganda. The visual record underlines a theme present in the archives: ordinary objects in extraordinary contexts. The image of the gun in a domestic setting encapsulates its strategic role. It was both a weapon and a concealed tool of defiance. Technical reviews conducted after 1945 debated whether the Sten's faults could have been mitigated without losing its essential advantages. Engineers proposed reinforced feed lips, spring redesigns, and alternative magazine attachments. Their papers are meticulous, full of measured variables. Yet the central conclusion persisted: improvements that increased production complexity would have reduced throughput, undermining the strategic benefit. The trade-off favored simplicity. Longitudinal studies of occupation show correlated declines in supply line reliability where resistance actions were dense. Those studies interpolate from varied sources: shipping manifests, rail timetables, and municipal records of goods shortages. The causal link to armed sabotage is probabilistic but consistent. When small arms supply increased, so too did the frequency and audacity of attacks. The Sten was an enabling variable, not a deterministic one. Its presence raised the probability of disruption. In a narrow administrative note, a post-war planner recorded a final observation: wartime resource constraints had produced a design optimized for clandestine logistics. The observation is neither celebratory nor condemnatory. It is precise, empirical, and conclusive in scope. The weapon's aesthetic failure was its strategic success. The Sten left technical traces beyond European theaters. Reports show limited transfers to partisan movements in Asia, where local craftsmen adapted magazines to different calibers. Photographs from irregular theaters demonstrate improvisation: magazines modified, stocks shortened, and barrels relapped in field workshops. Those adaptations reiterate a central quality. The weapons-based design served as a template for field innovation. Its modularity permitted local solutions. Scholars analyzing wartime economies later considered the Sten in models of industrial choice. They compared the opportunity cost of steel allocation between high-precision arms and mass-produced simple arms. Economic appendices show that small investments in simple tooling produced large marginal increases in armament quantities. The analyses used contemporary industrial metrics and remain a reference point in studies of constrained manufacturing under threat. The conclusions were technical and narrow: given fixed inputs, output type matters more than output quality for certain strategic objectives. Veterans' memoirs added texture to the archival record. A courier in Holland described carrying components in a pram pushed past German checkpoints. He wrote that officials rarely inspected prams in the cold months. An SOE operative recounted filing rough edges on a magazine with a broken comb. These recollections are anecdotal, but when read alongside logistics reports, they corroborate patterns of concealment and improvisation. The lived experience of moving metal through occupied towns appears consistent across multiple testimonies. The legal and moral aftermath of clandestine supply created complexities. Post-war courts considered the status of resistance fighters who used Stens in assassinations and reprisals. Judges and prosecutors examined the circumstances of occupation and coercion, and many concluded that the legality of armed resistance could not be judged by peacetime standards alone. The records are cautious, they rarely equate supply with guilt or innocence. Nevertheless, court documents preserve operational detail. They become sources historians use to reconstruct actions that otherwise lack formal military records. In technical museums, curators preserved Stens alongside user manuals and maintenance notes. They exhibited not only the weapon but the jigs and presses that produced its magazines. Visitors could see how simple fixtures produced repeatable components. Exhibitions framed the Sten as industrial and social history combined. The displays emphasized process over glamour, instructing audiences to read the weapon as an artifact of supply, policy, and civic cooperation. Strategic assessments in defense schools used the Sten to teach adaptability. Officers learned that force multiplication could occur through distribution and training, not only through technological advantage. Seminars included exercises where students allocated limited manufacturing hours to competing priorities. The exercises often yielded the same solution: prioritize volume when the objective involves empowering distributed actors operating under concealment. The pedagogical point was specific and enduring. International comparisons followed. Analysts compared the Sten's diffusion to other low-cost weapons systems employed in subsequent conflicts. They noted parallels in insurgencies where simple arms redefined the battlefield. The comparisons treat the Sten as a prototype in a lineage of weapons that favor accessibility over technical superiority. Those studies are analytical, not elegiac. They focus on measurable outcomes rather than narratives of heroism. In the last public interview of a former SOE supply officer, he described the satisfaction of seeing a mapped increase in sabotage after a series of drops. He spoke without flourish, noting only that more weapons meant more opportunities. The sentence is small and precise. It reflects the posture of those who planned logistics. Success was measured in functional terms, not rhetorical ones. Historians revisiting resistance strategies in the 21st century find the Sten an instructive case in emergent warfare. They analyze data using geospatial mapping, overlaying drop zones with incidents of rail disruption and sabotage. Modern techniques reinforce earlier conclusions about distribution effects. When supply density exceeds a threshold, incidents become clustered, and the occupation's administrative capacity degrades. The Sten's role appears less as a singular tool and more as a systemic variable in occupation dynamics. Material culture studies highlight the gun's physical plainness as communicative. Objects that blend into domestic spaces alter perception and risk. The Sten's appearance facilitated concealment and thus operational persistence. Photographers who later documented resistance relics emphasized this aspect. They photographed guns next to household items, creating compositions that visually argue for ordinary concealment practices. The images are evidentiary and rhetorical in equal measure. Technical comparisons with contemporaneous submachine designs remain blunt. On ballistic tables, the Sten lags behind more refined weapons in accuracy and reliability. Those tables appear in dry appendices, full of numbers and test conditions. Yet when analysts model real-world occupations rather than controlled ranges, those shortcomings lessen in importance. The operational context changes the meaning of technical metrics. Range and cyclic rate yield to portability and concealability in models of urban insurgency. Anthropologists studying post-war communities recorded subtle shifts in social memory. In villages where Sten drops were frequent, commemorative practices often focused on collective effort rather than individual valor. Plaques and memorials list units and actions in sparse language. Oral histories emphasize the logistics of survival, where weapons were hidden, who maintained them, how they were passed between households. The focus is practical, confirming that the Sten's legacy is embedded in social practice. A comparative study of resistance success across regions controlled for terrain, urban density, and supply availability. It found that regions with dense supply networks, including frequent Sten drops, exhibited higher rates of successful sabotage. The study is statistical and cautious. It refrains from attributing causality to a single factor. Still, the correlation strengthens an argument already present in intelligence files: accessible arms matter. The Sten was critical precisely because it was accessible. Conversations with former manufacturers reveal another dimension. Many wartime workers returned to peacetime occupations. Some kept small tools used to stamp magazines, repurposing them in local workshops. The physical remnants of wartime production entered post-war economies in mundane ways. These traces are material evidence of a conversion from wartime urgency to peacetime normalcy. The objects persisted, their meanings shifted. In military curricula, the Sten case study continues to provoke debate about procurement priorities. Some argue for investment in high-end precision, others advocate stockpiles of simple, portable arms for irregular support. The debate is practical and perennial. It centers on decision-making under uncertainty, not on nostalgia. The Sten remains a reference point precisely because it forces planners to confront trade-offs in resource allocation. A final technical paper published decades after the war summed the argument succinctly: weapons designed for concealment and ease of manufacture produce strategic effects disproportionate to their technical merit. The paper's language is careful. It leaves normative questions aside. It presents evidence and concludes within a narrow empirical frame. In quiet repositories, a ledger records the last official entry for Sten distributions. It lists coordinates, recipient cells, and quantities with a clerk's handwriting. The ledger is unadorned and factual. It ends with an administrative note: supplies ceased as front lines moved inward. The notation is procedural. It documents a transition from clandestine supply to overt military operations. The instrument that had been essential for covert action was no longer necessary on a battlefield reshaped by conventional force. Survivors who handled the weapon in cellars and barns often described mundane practicalities rather than dramatic moments. They recall oiling bolts, securing magazines with string, and checking stocks before curfew. Their testimony emphasizes routine maintenance and concealment habits. These small acts, preparing, hiding, repairing, compose the material history of resistance. They reveal how ordinary labor sustained extraordinary political aims. Museum exhibits now place a Sten beside a map of railroad disruptions and a list of airdrop coordinates. The curated presentation is deliberate. It invites a calculation rather than an emotional response. Visitors encounter metal and margin notes, and they are left to reconcile the plain object with its recorded effects. The juxtaposition teaches the same lesson that wartime planners recorded: strategic value can reside in the mundane. Academic treatments conclude with a restrained assessment. The Sten did not transform the nature of war single-handedly. It altered one element of occupation: the distribution of small arms among non-state actors. That alteration, when multiplied across regions and years, contributed to the erosion of control. The assessment is precise. It credits logistics and human networks equally. The last recorded reflection in an operational file reads: without flourish, availability engenders opportunity. The sentence is short and exact. It names the mechanism by which a simple, inexpensive object amplified the capacity for resistance. The observation is clinical and final. It leaves the fact standing without embellishment.